The smell hit first, a sour mix of sweat, hay, and cheap whiskey. Somewhere in that darkness, a man laughed. The kind of laugh that didn't belong to the living. Guaranteed your money back if they don't obey you. The shout cracked through the barn like a gunshot. Men cheered, boots stomped, coins clinked. Under the dim lantern stood two Apache women, barefoot, wrists tied,
Guaranteed
skin
your
bruised by
money
rope.
back
The
if
older
they
one,
don't
Ayana,
obey
kept her
you.
chin up, but her breath shook. The younger Ayoka couldn't lift her eyes. Before we go any further into this story, don't forget to like this video and tell us where you're watching from down in the comments. It helps these Wild West love stories reach more hearts who still believe in courage and kindness under the same sun that burned the frontier. Now, back to the barn. They were being sold like cattle. The dealer, Amos Glay, strutted across the dirt floor, swinging his hat like a preacher at a carnival. "You can't find obedience like this no more," he barked. "Young, strong, guaranteed to please, or your money back." The crowd roared again, whiskey breath mixing with greed. At the back of the barn stood a man who hadn't meant to stop here at all. Luke Carver, a rancher from the edge of the New Mexico territory, had come to Dry Creek to buy a wagon axle. Instead, he found hell dressed like entertainment. He watched long enough to know what he was seeing and long enough to remember why he couldn't turn away. Years ago, he'd seen a woman die tied to a post while men laughed just like this. When Amos shoved Ayana forward, Luke spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. "I'll take them." The room froze. Someone laughed nervously. "Both?" Amos sneered. "That'll cost you." Luke pulled a leather pouch from his coat and dropped it on the crate. Coins spilled, heavy as judgment. "That enough to shut you up?" No one moved. Amos hesitated, then smiled thinly. "Yours, Cowboy. Don't bring them back when they break." Luke stepped forward, drew his knife, and sliced the rope binding their wrists. The women flinched, not believing freedom could sound like that small, clean cut. He didn't touch them, didn't speak again, just turned toward the door and said, "Let's go." The laughter behind them followed into the night ugly, fading, swallowed by the wind. Out there, under the vast New Mexico stars, the road waited dusty, empty, and about to remember what mercy looked like. The wagon wheels groaned against the dry dirt road, a slow, weary sound that echoed under the moon. The town of Dry Creek had already vanished behind them, swallowed by dust and silence. Ayana sat in the back of the wagon, wrists raw where the rope had bitten deep. Her sister, Ayoka, leaned against her shoulder, shivering beneath a torn blanket Luke had tossed their way. The desert night was colder than they expected. Even fear couldn't keep the warmth in. Luke Carver drove without looking back. The trail ahead cut through the flats like a scar, straight, endless, cruel. He didn't speak, didn't glance at the two shapes huddled behind him. He'd done his part, or at least the part his conscience demanded. But still, he didn't stop. Ahyoka's voice broke the silence. "Where are you taking us?" Her words trembled, like a bird testing broken wings. Luke didn't turn. Away from men who think people can be bought. Ayana's eyes narrowed. "And after that?" He exhaled slowly. "After that, we'll see." The night stretched on. Wind swept across the flats, whispering through the sagebrush. Every so often, Luke would glance up at the stars, the same ones he used to count beside his wife before she died. The same stars that watched him fail her. Now they burned like judgment above him. He stopped once, near a dry creek bed where the moonlight glimmered on scattered rocks. He climbed down, pulled a canteen from the saddle, and handed it toward Ayana. She hesitated before taking it. The metal was warm from his hand. She drank first, then passed it to Ayoka, her eyes never leaving Luke. "Why did you pay for us?" she asked quietly. Luke's answer came slow. "Because no one else would." He turned away, tightening the reins, as if the question itself had reopened something buried too deep. The younger sister fell asleep soon after, her head resting against Ayana's arm. But Ayana stayed awake, studying the man at the front of the wagon. His shoulders were broad, his movement steady, but there was something haunted about the way he kept his distance, like a man who feared what kindness might cost. By dawn, the world had turned pale gold. The wagon crested a ridge, revealing a valley below dry land, scattered mesquite, and in the distance, a small cabin leaning against the wind. Luke slowed the horse. "That's home," he said. The word sounded strange in his mouth, like something he hadn't spoken in years. Ayanna looked at the house, then at him. "Yours? Or ours?" He met her gaze for the first time. "We'll figure that out." And as the sun rose over the empty land, the dust behind them settled, leaving only the sound of hooves and the faint, impossible idea of mercy. The cabin looked like it had been built to keep the world out. Wood darkened by years of wind and Sunday, a porch half sagged under its own weight. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows. Just silence, the kind that could bury a man if he stayed long enough. Luke Carver climbed down first, his boots crunching on the hard earth. He untied the reins, led the horse to a small trough, and poured water from a barrel beside the door. The motion was practiced quiet, steady, almost reverent. Ayanna helped Ahioka climb from the wagon. The younger woman's legs trembled when they touched the ground. Her bare feet sank into the dust. She looked around, eyes wide. "There's no one here," she whispered. Luke heard her. "That's the point." He opened the cabin door with a slow push. The hinges groaned. Inside was a single room bare, practical. A narrow bed, a wooden table, a stove blackened from years of use. A rifle leaned in one corner, a few tools hung neatly on the wall. There was no woman's touch, no softness, no scent but wood and iron. Ayanna hesitated on the threshold. She'd spent months in tents, wagons, barns that smelled of sweat and rope. Yet somehow this emptiness made her chest tighten more. She didn't know if it was safety or another kind of cage. Luke lit a lantern and set it on the table. The glow stretched across the floorboards, catching the edge of a cracked mirror and a framed photograph turned face down. He poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of Ayanna. "Drink." Her hand shook when she took it, not from weakness, but from suspicion. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, and chose not to care. When Ahioka finished drinking, Luke spoke again. "You can sleep there tonight," he said, nodding to the bed. "I'll take the floor." Ayanna frowned. "You're not asking for anything?" Luke shook his head, removing his coat. "No, you've had enough taken from you." He didn't look at her when he said it. He just moved to the stove, stoking the fire back to life. The warmth filled the room, soft at first, then steady. Ahioka sank onto the bed, exhausted. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. The lamplight flickered across her face, softening the bruises. Ayanna stayed standing, watching the man across the room. He had the build of someone who had worked too long alone, broad shoulders, scarred hands, movements deliberate and silent. There was no greed in his eyes, but no gentleness either, just distance. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Luke didn't turn. "Because I remember what it feels like to need help and find none." He knelt to roll out a blanket on the floor by the stove. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll need it." The way he spoke left no room for argument, but no threat either. Ayanna stood for another long moment, as if her body didn't yet believe in stillness. Then she moved toward the bed. She didn't lie beside her sister, only sat on the edge, fingers twisting the fabric of the blanket. Luke lay down on the floor, one arm folded under his head, eyes on the ceiling. The fire popped, sending sparks up the stovepipe. For a while, that was the only sound. When Ayanna finally lay back, her eyes stayed open, staring into the dark. Every instinct told her to be ready to run, to fight, to surrender before being taken. But nothing came. No footsteps, no hand reaching out. Only the slow rhythm of his breathing, steady and calm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. Ayanna closed her eyes, listening to it scrape against the cabin walls. She'd forgotten what quiet could sound like. For Luke, sleep didn't come. He stared at the roof beams and thought of his wife, her laughter buried under 6 feet of desert earth. He thought of the men who had taken her from him, and how he'd sworn never to watch another life be broken if he could stop it. Now 2 strangers slept under his roof, and he didn't know if he'd saved them or just chained himself to another ghost. When dawn finally crept through the cracks of the window, the fire had burned low. Luke sat up slowly, his back stiff from the floor. He looked toward the bed. Both women still slept curled close, faces soft in the first light. For the first time in 5 years, his cabin didn't feel empty. He didn't smile, but something in his chest eased. He stood, reached for his coat, and whispered to no one, "All right then, let's see what comes next." Morning came quietly, as it often did in the New Mexico hills. Pale light spilled across the floorboards, painting dust motes that moved like ghosts in the air. The fire in the stove had gone cold. The smell of smoke still lingered. Luke Carver stepped outside before either woman stirred. The air was sharp with frost. The sky, washed silver by dawn. He walked to the trough, splashed water on his face, and looked out across the dry land. Nothing moved except a hawk circling above the ridge. Inside, Ayanna woke first. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Her heart kicked, hands flying to her wrists, expecting rope. But the skin there was bare. The marks had begun to fade, though the memory hadn't. Ahioka mumbled softly, still half asleep. Ayanna brushed her sister's hair from her face. The girl looked peaceful for the first time in months, her lips parting with even breaths. The cabin door creaked open. Luke stepped back inside, the smell of cold wind and horse clinging to his coat. He moved like someone who'd lived years without speaking unless necessary. "Water's warm now," he said simply, setting a kettle on the stove. Ayanna didn't answer. She was watching him every movement, every sound. There was something unsettling about a man who neither threatened nor promised. Ahioka sat up, rubbing her eyes. "You got coffee?" she asked, voice small. Luke glanced over his shoulder. "Not much. Enough for a morning." The girl smiled faintly, as if that small kindness meant more than he'd know. Ayanna kept her guard up. She couldn't understand a man who offered help without a price. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, slid one across the table toward Ayanna. "You can help if you want," he said. "Or rest. No one's forcing you." The words hung heavy between them. "No one's forcing you." Ayanna took the cup, felt its heat against her palms, and studied him. "Why did you pay for us?" Luke didn't meet her eyes. "Because I couldn't stomach leaving you there." "That simple?" She pressed. He nodded. "Simple's about all I have left." Ahioka looked between them, unsure whether to smile or shrink. The air carried the weight of things unsaid, the past, the distrust, the fear that this quiet might break any second. After breakfast, Luke stepped outside again. The door shut behind him with a heavy sound. Ahioka turned to her sister. "He's different." Ayanna scoffed softly. They all seemed different at first. But her voice lacked conviction. Outside, Luke chopped wood. Each strike of the axe echoed against the hills like punctuation to his thoughts. He wasn't used to having voices in the cabin, nor the smell of hair oil and fabric instead of smoke and leather. He caught himself glancing at the door more than once, as if unsure whether to go back in or keep his distance. By midday, the sisters had swept the floor, washed what little cookware there was, and folded the blanket that had covered them. It was Ahioka's idea. "Feels better when things look right," she'd said. When Luke came back, sweat streaked his neck, shirt sticking to his shoulders. He stopped short at the doorway. The cabin looked lived in. Ayanna stood by the table, chin lifted. "We cleaned. Didn't ask permission." Luke shrugged. "Didn't need to." He poured himself a cup of water, drank, and added, "You plan to stay?" Ayanna's eyes flickered. "For now. Until we figure out what you want." "I already told you," he said quietly. "Nothing." That word cut deeper than she expected. Later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ahioka hummed a tune, an old Apache lullaby their mother used to sing. Luke listened from outside, mending the fence rail, his hands moving slower as the sound reached him. The melody wound through the dry air like smoke. When he stepped back inside, the firelight caught the gold in her hair and the calm in Ayanna's eyes. For a second, he saw something he hadn't dared to imagine. Peace. He nodded once toward the kettle. "Soup's on the shelf. Dried venison. Not much, but it'll do." Ayanna hesitated, then reached for it. "We'll cook." Their eyes met briefly, no smile, no promise, but an understanding. That night, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a beginning. Luke lay awake on the floor, staring at the ceiling beams. Above him, Ayanna and Ahioka whispered softly in their language, voices barely louder than the wind outside. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. It had been a long time since he'd fallen asleep to the sound of hope. Days passed slowly in the hills, marked by the rhythm of small, ordinary things: water fetched from the creek, firewood stacked by the door, the clatter of tin cups on the table. Ordinary, but not empty. For the first time in years, Luke Carver woke to more than silence. Sometimes it was the soft sound of Ahioka humming while sweeping, or the low murmur of Ayana talking to the horse outside the cabin. He never said it, but those sounds changed something inside him. The place no longer felt like a grave. Each morning began the same. He split logs, repaired the corral, and rode out to check the herd. The sisters stayed behind, tending to what they could. Ahioka had a quick smile and a light touch she learned fast, laughing when she burned the first batch of bread. Ayana didn't laugh much at all, but she worked with quiet purpose, her movements precise, her eyes sharp as flint. Luke respected that. He didn't ask about the marks on her arms or the look she carried whenever someone's shadow crossed the wall. Some wounds didn't need names. One afternoon, Ahioka called from the porch. "There's a storm coming from the west." Luke looked up from the corral. The sky was bruised with dark clouds, rolling fast across the desert. The air smelled of rain and dust, rare, wild. He motioned toward the barn. "Get the horse inside. Tie the latch." Ayana helped, her hand sure despite the wind cutting through her hair. The storm broke an hour later, drumming against the roof in heavy sheets. Inside, the three of them waited. The wind howled through the cracks, the lantern flickered, and for a long while no one spoke. Then Ahioka laughed bright. "Unexpected. It sounds like the sky's angry." Luke smiled faintly. The first time in months he'd let it show. "The sky's got a right to be." Ayana glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. When the rain eased, they shared what little food they had: beans, bread, and coffee. The fire crackled. Ahioka began to tell stories from their village. How her grandfather once chased lightning across the plains. How their mother braided their hair with hawk feathers for courage. Luke listened in silence. When Ayana noticed, she asked, "You had family?" He hesitated, eyes fixed on the fire. "Had a wife. She's gone." "How?" He didn't look up. "Men took more than they needed." The room went still. Ahioka lowered her gaze. Ayana nodded slowly. "Same kind of men took our village," she said. "Two different stories, one shared wound." After that, something changed. The silence between them no longer felt like walls, it felt like breathing space. Over the next days, Ayana began to help Luke with the herd. He showed her how to mend a fence, how to hold the wire without cutting her palms. When she stumbled, he reached out instinctively but stopped before touching her. She noticed and for the first time, didn't step back. Ahioka, meanwhile, found her laughter again. She followed Luke around the corral, pestering him with questions about horses, guns, and the stars. "Do you name them?" she asked one evening, pointing at the horses. Luke nodded. "Only the ones that fight back." Ayana's lips curved, barely. "Then I suppose we'd earn names here." He caught the hint of humor and let it linger between them like a truce. That night, they ate under a sky washed clean by rain. The stars seemed closer, sharper. Ahioka dozed off near the fire, and Luke handed Ayana a blanket. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but I'm not running anymore." He nodded once, words caught in his throat. The wind carried the scent of sage through the open door, soft and cool. For the first time, Ayana didn't flinch when it brushed her skin. For the first time, Luke didn't feel alone. In the stillness that followed, none of them spoke. But the silence was no longer heavy, it was healing. And in that fragile quiet, somewhere between trust and forgiveness, they began to breathe again. By late spring, the hills around Luke's ranch turned gold. Dry grass swayed in the wind, and the sky stretched wide enough to make a man feel both free and small. Life had found a rhythm again, steady, simple, quiet. Every morning, Luke Carver rode out with Ayana to check the fence lines while Ahioka tended the fire, humming soft Apache tunes that drifted across the yard. The cabin no longer felt like a place of ghosts. It felt like a place that breathed. But peace never lasted long in the frontier. That afternoon, dust appeared on the horizon, thin at first, then thickening into a swirl that caught the Sunday. Luke froze, eyes narrowing. "Riders," he said. Ayanna followed his gaze. Her hand instinctively went to the knife she kept hidden in her skirt seam. "Get inside," Luke ordered quietly. "Take your sister. Don't open the door unless you hear my voice." Ayanna didn't argue. She ran for the cabin, grabbed Ahioka by the wrist, and pulled her toward the cellar hatch beneath the floorboards. "Who is it?" Ahioka whispered, eyes wide. "The kind of men who take what they want," Ayanna replied. Above them, the sound of hooves grew louder, pounding like thunder. Luke stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his jaw set. The first rider crested the ridge, a heavy man in a brown duster with a silver tooth that caught the light when he grinned. Silas Crow, one of Amos Glee's hired collectors. "Afternoon, Carver," Silas called. "Heard you made a purchase you forgot to pay full price for." Luke said nothing. He leaned his shoulder against the post, barrel down, calm as a man guarding a grave. "Two Apache girls," Silas continued, spitting dust from his mouth. "You hand 'em over. We'll forget this visit. Ain't got anyone here but me." Luke replied evenly. "That's funny," Silas sneered. "Town says you rode off with company." Luke's eyes flicked toward the distant barn. "Town says a lot of things. You can look if you like, but step one boot inside my fence, and I'll make sure you don't ride out again." The riders shifted uneasily. They knew Luke's reputation, a man who'd buried raiders without raising his voice. Silas laughed, but it rang hollow. "You talk big for a man alone." Luke raised the rifle, slow and deliberate. "You'd be surprised how quiet dying can sound." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut air. Wind rattled the dry leaves. Then, as quick as it came, the tension broke. Silas spat into the dirt. "Ain't worth it," he muttered to his men. "Ain't no Apache worth dying for." They turned their horses and rode off, dust swallowing them again. Luke waited until the sound faded before lowering his rifle. His heart beat hard against his ribs, not from fear, but from the memory of what losing had once felt like. Inside the cellar, Ayanna held Ahioka close, listening. When the hoofbeats vanished, she climbed up, pushing the hatch open. Luke was standing by the door, shoulders tense, eyes on the horizon. "They're gone," he said quietly. Ayanna stepped closer, studying his face. "You could have handed us over." Luke turned to her then, his voice steady. "I don't hand people over." Something in her chest cracked open, something she didn't know she'd been holding. Ahioka ran forward, wrapping her arms around Luke's waist in silent gratitude. He stiffened for a heartbeat, then rested one rough hand on her shoulder. The world outside the cabin stayed dangerous. But inside, for that single moment, they were safe. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. Ayanna sat by the hearth, sewing a tear in Luke's sleeve. He didn't ask her to. She didn't ask permission. "You could have died today," she said quietly. Luke's eyes stayed on the flames. "Better that than live with what I saw in that barn again." The air between them grew still. Ahioka dozed near the stove, her small frame curled beneath a blanket. Ayanna spoke again, barely a whisper. "You're not like the others." Luke looked up, his voice rough. "Neither are you." Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the empty valley. But for the first time, those sounds didn't stir fear. They were just part of the night, wild, distant, and honest. And in that small, flickering cabin, three people who had every reason to mistrust the world finally began to trust each other instead. The storm that had passed through their lives left no thunder, only silence, deep and heavy like the sky before rain. After the men rode away, the land around Luke's ranch seemed to breathe again. The dust settled. The wind grew soft. Even the horses stood calmer, as if they, too, sensed the danger had gone. Inside the cabin, life found a new rhythm. Ahioka began singing again while she worked, the tune rising and falling like wind over the plains. Ayanna fixed the broken hinge on the door and mended Luke's old shirt. Her stitches were neat, deliberate, the way someone rebuilt herself thread by thread. Luke Carver didn't say much. He repaired the fence lines, sharpened his axe, and checked the horizon each morning out of habit. But his shoulders had loosened. The tension that once lived in him had started to ease. That evening, when the light dipped gold and long shadows reached the porch, Ayana stepped outside. She found Luke stacking kindling near the fire pit, his sleeves rolled, forearms streaked with dirt and sweat. "You still think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Men like that don't forget losing face. But I'm ready if they do." "We are too," she replied. Luke looked up then, meeting her eyes. The last rays of sunlight caught her cheek, and for a brief moment, he saw not a stranger or a rescued victim, but someone who had stood beside him through fear and silence alike. They built the fire together as night came down, its glow flickering across their faces. Ahioka joined them with a pot of beans and a half loaf of bread. The three sat close to the flames, the air carrying the scent of smoke and sage. For a long while, no one spoke. Then Ahioka broke the quiet. "If we stay," she said softly, "are we yours?" Luke blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "In our village," Ayana explained, "if a man shelters a woman, people say she belongs to him, that she owes him her life." Luke's eyes dropped to the fire. The flames reflected in his gaze, steady but sad. "No one belongs to me," he said finally. "You stay because you choose, not because you're bought or owed." Ahioka smiled faintly. "Then I choose to stay." Ayana said nothing, but the look in her eyes spoke more than words could. The night deepened. Crickets began their slow rhythm in the grass. Ahioka fell asleep beside the fire, her head resting against her sister's arm. Luke stood and fetched a blanket, draping it gently over the girl's shoulders. When he straightened, Ayana was watching him. "Why do you keep doing that?" she asked quietly. "Caring for people who leave one day." He shrugged. "Because it's the only thing that ever made the world feel right." She studied him in the flicker of the firelight. He looked older than she'd first thought, worn, weathered, but not broken. There was a steadiness in him that made her chest ache, the kind of strength that didn't come from guns or fists, but from surviving every loss and still choosing to be kind. "You remind me of my father," she murmured. "He said the same thing before the soldiers came." Luke didn't answer. He just sat beside her, staring into the flames. After a while, Ayana reached for her knife and began carving something into a small piece of cedar, a circle, split by a single line. She handed it to him. "What's it mean?" he asked. "Two halves of the same sky," she said. "A promise. You keep one half, I keep the other." Luke turned the carving in his hand, the firelight glinting on its smooth edge. "You believe in promises?" She smiled faintly. "I believe in keeping them." The wind shifted then, carrying the smell of rain from far off. Above them, the stars blinked through a veil of cloud. Luke placed the cedar token in his pocket, close to his heart. "Then I'll keep mine." Ayana looked at him, the firelight dancing across her face. "And what promise is that?" He met her gaze. "That no one hurts you again while I still breathe." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the pop of burning wood and the quiet rhythm of Ahioka's sleep. In the glow of that fire, under a sky that had seen too much loss, three people sat together, not bound by blood, or law, or debt, but by choice. And in that choice, the Wild West, so often cruel and hollow, felt, for once, like home. The morning rose like a promise. The horizon glowed with slow fire, and the valley stretched wide beneath it, quiet, golden, alive. The desert wind was gentle that day, brushing through the sage and carrying the faint scent of rain long gone. Luke Carver was already awake, outside by the trough, splitting cedar. The axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, wood cracking cleanly beneath his hands. His breath came slow and even, the way a man breathes when he has nothing left to prove. Inside the cabin, Ayana stirred. Her body no longer ached the way it used to after restless nights. The weight of old fear had lifted little by little, like dust carried off by wind. She sat up, her dark braid falling over her shoulder, and listened. The familiar sound of the axe, the scent of coffee on the stove, the silence between, none of it frightened her anymore. Beside her, Ahioka still slept, one arm thrown over her face, her lips curved faintly in a dream. She had started laughing again, humming songs from their childhood. That small, simple joy was proof enough that they had survived something worth leaving behind. Ayana stood, stepped quietly to the door, and pushed it open. The air was crisp. Luke paused mid-swing when he saw her. You work before you eat, she teased softly. Luke leaned on the handle of the axe. Only way I know how. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing playfully. And what happens when you run out of fences to fix? He looked at her for a moment, sunlight touching the scar that ran through his brow. Then he smiled barely, but enough. Then I start building something new. Her lips curved in answer, a smile that came from somewhere she hadn't let anyone reach in a long time. They ate breakfast together on the porch, cornbread, dried apples, and bitter coffee. Ahioka joined them later, barefoot and yawning, her hair tangled from sleep. She looked around, eyes half closed. It's quiet, she murmured. Too quiet. I like it. Luke chuckled. You'll change your mind when winter comes. Then we'll sing louder, Ahioka said, grinning. The laughter that followed wasn't forced. It came easily, carried by the same wind that once brought only silence and fear. When the dishes were washed and the day settled into its slow rhythm, Luke saddled his horse. Gonna ride to town, he said. We're low on flour and salt. Ayana nodded, tying a length of rope she'd been braiding. You shouldn't go alone. Men in town still talk. He paused, tightening the strap on the saddle. They can talk. They always do. She looked at him for a moment, something like worry flickering behind her calm. Then take this, she said, handing him a small cloth bundle. Inside was the cedar token she'd carved nights ago, half a circle split by a single line. Luke turned it in his hand, tracing the grain with his thumb. You kept the other half? Ayana nodded. If someone asks who you ride for, tell them you already belong to something worth keeping. He swallowed hard. The words caught somewhere deep. I'll be back before sundown. We'll be here, she said simply. The wagon creaked forward, wheels rolling over dry earth. Ayana stood on the porch, watching until the dust swallowed him whole. Ahioka waved until her arms ached, then went inside to start the fire. The sisters spent the morning mending things, shirts, saddle straps, the cracked rim of a tin cup. Ahioka filled the yard with her humming again. Ayana found herself pausing now and then, listening to the sound, realizing how long it had been since peace had felt real. When she stepped outside, she noticed the quiet differently this time. It wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space to think, to breathe, to exist. By noon, the sun beat hard against the hills, and sweat beaded on her skin as she hauled water from the trough. She stopped once, leaning on the bucket, eyes drifting toward the ridge where Luke had disappeared hours before. He'd said he'd come back before sundown, and she believed him. The day burned on. The sky turned from blue to bronze, then softened into violet. Shadows stretched long over the cabin when the sound of hooves finally rose from the trail. Ahioka ran outside first, her voice bright. He's back. Luke came into view, the wagon half full flour, salt, a coil of rope, and something else. A second horse followed behind, smaller, sleek, its coat the color of dusk. He climbed down, dusted his hat, and caught the look on Ayana's face. You bought another horse? She asked. For whoever stays long enough to ride it. Ahioka clapped her hands. Then it's mine. Luke smiled at her excitement but kept his gaze on Ayana. I meant you. She met his eyes steady, unreadable, and for the first time didn't look away. That evening, they ate together 3 bowls, one fire, and laughter that came easily. Outside, the desert night unfolded in a blanket of stars. The air smelled of mesquite and ash. Ayana leaned back in her chair, staring at the fire. You could have left us in that barn, she said quietly. Luke didn't flinch. I didn't save you, he replied. I just gave you a chance to save yourselves. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then you've done more than most. Ahioka yawned and leaned her head on her sister's shoulder. We're not going anywhere, she murmured. Luke banked the fire, eyes soft. Good, he said. I was hoping you wouldn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of peace settling deep into old wounds. When the lantern burned low and the sisters fell asleep, Luke stepped outside. The moon hung high, pale over the hills. He reached into his pocket and took out the cedar token the half she'd given him. He turned it once in his hand, feeling the smooth curve, then closed his fist around it. The wind rustled through the sage, whispering against his coat like a prayer. Inside the cabin, Ayanna stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment. Through the open doorway, she saw him standing there, still as a sentinel, silvered by moonlight. She smiled faintly, then drifted back to sleep. And as the night deepened, the land itself seemed to rest no chains, no debts, no fear. Just three souls who had chosen to stay, not because they were forced to, but because they'd finally found something worth belonging to. A home not given by law, not taken by force, but earned by kindness, courage, and the quiet mercy of a man who once thought he'd forgotten how to love. Sometimes the quietest endings are the ones that stay with us the longest. After the storms, the fear, and the long silence that defined their lives, Luke, Ayanna, and Ahyoka finally found something the frontier rarely gave anyone, peace that didn't need to be earned through pain. Their story isn't about miracles or destiny. It's about ordinary acts of mercy that become extraordinary when the world has forgotten how to be kind. Luke Carver began as a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Yet somehow, in choosing to open his door, he opened his heart again. Ayanna arrived broken, stripped of dignity and trust, but found strength in the one place she least expected it, in the calm presence of a man who didn't ask for anything in return. And little Ahyoka, the youngest, carried laughter back into a home that had long forgotten its sound. Maybe that's what the West was always about. Not gunfights or gold, but survival of the spirit. Not who owned the land, but who learned to live gently upon it. Because sometimes, salvation doesn't ride in on a horse, it walks quietly beside you, carrying firewood, sharing bread, or simply choosing to stay. There's a moment in every life when we have to decide what kind of home we're building, one made of fences or one made of trust. Luke chose the latter, and in doing so, gave meaning to all the years he thought he'd wasted. Ayanna and Ahyoka didn't need saving anymore. They needed someone who believed they were worth saving. Together, they reminded us that love doesn't have to be loud to be true. It can live in small gestures, soft words, and the decision to stand by someone when no one else will. And maybe that's a truth worth carrying beyond the story itself, because in a world that still feels harsh and divided, we could all use a little more of that quiet courage. So tonight, as the last embers fade and the wind hums softly against the window, take a moment to think about what home means to you. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing its warmth with someone who might need it too, and help keep these Wild West love stories alive with a like, a share, and a gentle reminder that kindness, once chosen, never really dies.